at the moment is, and we saw it last night on the Newsnight debate between the candidates as well, which was that the budget plans with which you went into this government contained around £30 billion of unspecified cuts in spending between now and 2014. And yet now we can't get you to talk about these cuts. Indeed, it's all Tory cuts now, and it's like Labour never intended any cuts, and that isn't true.
Well, I think we had set out about 38 billion was the spending reduction that we'd set out. And we had
about 30 of it was unspecified.
Well, actually, we set out, I think, more of where that would come from, because it included some restrictions on public sector pay. It included, I know in my own department and the DWP, it had included about £500 million reduction in some of the administration bureaucratic costs through things like putting job centre, applications online, series of things like that, but also measures from cutting unemployment. And we had about 15 billion that we were expecting to save from bringing unemployment down over the next 5 years. And I think that actually was the real crux of the debate today. I think Harriet did very well to make it about, in the end, if you don't get the economy growing, then you will see higher bills from unemployment, you will see more and more problems in terms of the deficit. So you actually need to support the economy now in order to get the deficit coming down in future.
Well, I thought, although people may, watching this, have felt slightly weary about it and thought it's the election debate going again, I think Yvette is right. It's absolutely crucial to the success or otherwise of this coalition government. They wanted to come in and to say, there's a crisis, therefore back us when we act. And what the Labour Party is trying to do is say, well, hold on, look at these Office of Budget Responsibility figures. There isn't really a crisis. Things are a little bit better on borrowing and on jobs and on inflation and elsewhere than perhaps people had feared. So this argument about the context is vital. If the coalition is to get support for what they themselves describe as incredibly difficult decisions, tougher, bigger cuts than Mrs Thatcher made and so on, they need the country to believe they're necessary, that they're not driven by ideology. And Labour equally, if they're to get back into power at any stage, have to convince people that this is not only unnecessary but dangerous.
You see, a lot of Conservatives were saying, when we get in, we will be able to say, we've seen the books and it's much worse than we thought, which is what Mr Wilson's government did in 1964 as well. Indeed, Reggie Modelling said to Mr Callaghan as he walked into the Treasury, and Modelling was walking out, the outgoing Chancellor said, by the way, it's much worse than you think, old cock. That was set that for there. But your Office of Budget Responsibility actually came out with figures which showed it wasn't worse than we thought. That in fact, under the OBR projections, based on the fiscal inheritance from Labour, you will need to borrow 32 billion less than Labour had said. Now, that doesn't mean that you still don't have to do cuts, but it wasn't worse, it was better.
Well, the structural deficit is worse than predicted. And the structural deficit is the one that actually you need to tackle. The cyclical deficit is kind of what happens when the economy goes into deep depression.
But it's worse by a couple of billion, it's nothing.
Well, a couple of billion here, a couple of billion there, pretty soon it's serious money. That's what has to be dealt with, because that's what you have to actually take out by tax increases or predominantly by cutting spending. But the fact is that Labour, Gordon Brown called the election after this financial year had already started, with cuts totalling 38 billion at least in the books, plus another significant amount of spending commitments.
No, this financial year was about supporting the economy, and that's the big difference between us. Your new government wants to cut support for the economy this year, when the recovery is still fragile, and when you're seeing all the difficulties in Europe and cutting things like 90,000 jobs from the Future Jobs Fund.
You have a very short memory.
That is what is so destructive.
I've got to tell you,
our proposals were very clear that we would support the economy this year.
It is really important to get this right. The first financial document I had on my desk when I arrived as a minister in charge of a department was, how are you going to implement these cuts, which are Labour's cuts in the baseline of the budget for this year? You called the election, you had put into the baseline for every department very significant cuts, plus, I might add, a whole lot of unfunded additional spending commitments, littered, and David Cameron referred to some of them in the debate just now, and no work done about where it was going to come from. And we're having to do that now. We're not only having to take out the 6 billion in-year savings that we said we would do, and we're doing that, Well, you shake your head,
This is
but I've got to tell you, this is
trick in the books is kind of, let's say we came in and suddenly it's so much more worse. But
well,
actually,
hang
the
on,
Office
hang
of the
on.
Budget Responsibility said that it wasn't. And
No,
in
hang
terms
on.
of the proposals for this year,
Because I
look
think
at
you
the
just
overall,
admitted.
No, hang on a second.
You admitted that there was 38 billion
let-
pounds of cuts.
Let Yvette Cooper
Overall.
speak,
And
and
you
then I'll
couldn't
come back to
even-
you,
And
Francis.
you couldn't even say where they
Second.
were in your
There's
own
no point both
Hang on
of
a
you
second.
speaking at the
No.
same time because no one can hear you. Yvette Cooper and then Francis Mott.
The 38 billion was over the course of the next few years. It was
That was
not
up to
about
2014.
That's right. That's right. Andrew is right. And
The
it was
first chunk
not
of it's
about.
this
No,
year.
it is not. No, it is not. This year was about completing the final year of the
didn't
final
read
spending
papers
review
very well.
and was all about continuing to support the economy. Now, it's true that every department had to continue making efficiency savings. That was always built in every single year. It was last year, it was the year before. And the Department for Work and Pensions every year was making further and further efficiency savings. So, of course, that's right. But in terms of what's the overall support for the economy, the overall support for jobs, we believed strongly that you need to keep support for the economy this year because the recovery is still fragile. You look at what's
All
happening
right.
in Europe, you look at the
I
risks,
understand you've made that
it will
point,
cost us far more if
you
we
made it
don't.
well. Let Francis Mott now reply.
Well, first of all, there were cuts in the baseline for this year, none of them enumerated. No money attached to projects or programmes or efficiencies. That had to be done by us. So the first task is implement Labour's cuts. Next task, take out the 6 billion in order to cut the extra tax on jobs that you left lying around, an unexploded bomb. And then we have to start dealing with the biggest structural deficit, bigger than Greece's. Our budget deficit that your government left, and you were Chief Secretary, you meant to be in charge of controlling public spending. That's the biggest budget deficit in Europe, bigger than Greece's, which,
All right.
as the
And how do
economists
you
said,
answer the criticism from the CIPD, which says that your proposals now will push
CIPD?
up? It's the Centre for the Institute for Personnel Development, John Philpott, who is an employment expert, who is projecting that unemployment will rise to nearly 3 million as a result of the additional cuts, not the proposals that were in the Labour government's plans, but the additional cuts that the Tory Liberal
All right.
government is proposing could push unemployment up to
we
3 million.
sh-
How do you
we
answer
shall-
that?
We will see. As someone with an economic background, I can tell you for every economic forecast, I can give you another one. MP's expenses, back in the headlines again.
Back
You
in
have
the
some
headlines.
thoughts?
Well, only to say it's very easy to watch MPs complaining about their expenses system and say, good grief, forget it. I'd only say I've talked to quite a wide range of MPs and people who are new, people who are used to computer technology, people who worked in the private sector. It is a genuine problem. For all people might look in from outside at Westminster and say, for goodness sake, belt up. There is clearly a problem, I think, for many MPs, simply just organisationally getting the money they need, that most people would think they need to get on and do their job. I'm not saying there isn't any whingy, of course there's whingy. I'm not saying there aren't people who tried it on under the old system and now trying it on again. There may well be. But my sense is, Andrew, beyond that, there is a real problem for MPs just having far too much of their time taken up dealing with the sort of tedium of trying to get money to do everything that people watching this programme would want them to do and not actually doing their proper job.
We have to stop now because I've got to go and do my expenses. Nick, we're going to talk about expenses in a minute, but we're going to free you to go and do other parts of the BBC, where he's always in great demand.
He is indeed. Now, look around. There's plastic everywhere. Even Andrew's new vuvuzela is made of it. And much of it, not his vuvuzela, is thrown away after just one use. Packaging, water bottles, cups. Much of it ends up in the sea as rubbish. Well, on his Soapbox TV travel presenter and author Simon Reeve explains how our throwaway society is poisoning the planet with plastic.
Back in the 1850s, so much sewage was being flushed into the River Thames that Parliament was suspended because of the great stink. The stench was so terrible that money was quickly raised for a network of sewers. And that's still the best way of getting things done. Unless you can see it, touch it, or smell it, then nothing much really happens. But right now, we're creating a new pollution crisis. Out of sight and out of mind, we're poisoning our oceans with plastic rubbish. Isolated in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, Hawaii should be paradise. But when I visited, I was shocked to discover beaches covered in plastic rubbish washed up from around the world. There are old toothbrushes, combs, and bits of plastic moulding. But because plastic doesn't biodegrade, it just breaks down into smaller and smaller pieces. The beaches were also covered with billions of small plastic pellets, and plastic flecks the size of individual grains of sand. So the sandy beaches were being transformed into plastic beaches. The Port of London Authority has set up a number of these rubbish traps here on the River Thames to try and stop some of this plastic waste from getting out and polluting the North Sea. Apart from a tiny quantity that's been incinerated, all the plastic that's ever been created is still out there in the environment somewhere. What we see on our beaches in here is just a fraction of the more than 100 million tonnes of plastic waste that's now clogging our oceans. The beaches in Hawaii are being swamped by plastic from the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, a vast accumulation of the world's plastic rubbish that's floating in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The patch is now twice the size of France, and it's doubling in size each decade. And there are similar garbage patches in the Atlantic Ocean as well.